I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, staring at a stack of unpaid envelopes that didn't belong to me. They were addressed to my children. That was the moment I understood something had shifted forever. My name is Alina Finch. I'm 70 years old, and until recently, I believed that being a good mother meant never letting my children feel the weight of their own choices. I believed love was measured in how much I could absorb so they wouldn't have to struggle. I was wrong. Before I tell you how this ended, before I tell you about the house, the silence, and the decision that shocked everyone, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone in this. I didn't stop paying their bills out of anger. I stopped because I finally ran out of excuses for them. For most of my adult life, I was dependable, predictable, safe. My children knew that no matter what happened, missed payments, bad decisions, sudden emergencies, I would quietly fix it. I didn't lecture. I didn't demand explanations. I just handled it. That habit didn't start with them. It started with my husband, Harold Finch. Harold was a planner, the kind of man who labeled folders and kept handwritten notes about insurance policies. He believed security was love. When he died 8 years ago, he left me a paid-off house, careful savings, and one unspoken expectation that I would protect what we built. At first, I did, but grief has a way of lowering your defenses. After Harold passed, my children showed up more often, not with flowers or concern, just suggestions, advice, opinions about what I should do next. Martin, my eldest, was the first. Confident, decisive, always sounding like he knew better. He said the house was too much for me, too big, too expensive, too unnecessary for a widow. Paula, my daughter, stepped in soon after. She offered to help manage my finances. Said she just wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed. She framed it as care, but her questions always circled the same thing: how much I had left. And then there was Kevin, my youngest. Quiet, avoidant, always struggling. He never asked directly, but his pauses said enough. His silences were requests. It started small, a utility bill here, a car repair there. I told myself it was temporary. Months turned into years. I paid Martin's business shortfalls, covered Paula's children's expenses, stepped in whenever Kevin just needed a little help. They stopped saying thank you at some point. I don't remember when, I only remember noticing it was gone. What they never asked was how I was doing. The only person who did was my neighbor, Ruth Calder. She noticed when my lights stayed on late, when my groceries got smaller, when I stopped mentioning family dinners. "You don't owe them your future," she said once gently while handing me soup. I smiled and changed the subject. It wasn't Ruth who finally forced me to look, it was numbers. One afternoon, I sat across from Samuel Brooks, my financial advisor. He had worked with Harold for years. He knew our habits, our values. He didn't sugarcoat things. "Alina," he said quietly, sliding a chart toward me, "at this rate, you'll outlive your money." The words landed harder than any argument ever could. I wasn't spending on myself. I wasn't traveling. I wasn't indulging. I was dissolving my future so my children wouldn't feel discomfort in the present. Samuel didn't tell me what to do. He just waited. I went home that day and stared at my kitchen wall for a long time. And then, without announcing it, without drama, without a family meeting, I stopped. I didn't send explanations. I didn't justify myself. I simply didn't pay. The first week, nothing happened. The second week, still nothing. Then the calls slowed. Then the visits stopped. Then the holidays passed without invitations. Silence is louder than shouting when you know what it means. 3 months went by, no birthday call, no just checking in, no concern, only absence. That's when the truth settled in with unbearable clarity. I wasn't their mother in their eyes anymore. I was their safety net. And once the net was gone, so was I. I didn't cry the way I expected to. I didn't rage. I felt something colder. Clearer. I began planning, not emotionally but practically. I spoke to Samuel again, then quietly met Diane Holloway, a real estate agent who understood discretion. I didn't tell my children. I didn't owe them an announcement. The house, the one they spoke about like it already belonged to them, went on the market. While they lived their lives assuming I'd still be there when they needed me, I was preparing to leave without a trace. And they had no idea. Not yet. Because the next thing I did was something none of them ever imagined I was capable of doing. The silence didn't happen all at once. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that everyone was busy, that emotions were still raw after the family meeting. I checked my phone constantly in those early weeks, half expecting one of them to call and say they'd thought about it and understood. I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, wondering if I could have said things more gently, more clearly, in a way that wouldn't have pushed them away. I even drafted messages I never sent, explanations they hadn't asked for, apologies for boundaries I shouldn't have felt guilty about setting. But days turned into weeks and the quiet settled in like dust. No calls, no visits. No casual texts asking how I was feeling or what I was doing that day. The house, once full of noise and interruptions, became unbearably still. I would set my phone down on the kitchen counter and deliberately walk into another room just to see if it would ring when I wasn't looking. It never did. At first, I reached out. I told myself I was being mature, that I wasn't going to let pride ruin my family. I called my oldest one Sunday morning, the time he used to come by for coffee. It rang until voicemail. I left a calm message, nothing emotional, just "I was thinking about you, call me when you have time." He never did. I texted my daughter a few days later asking about the kids' school year. The message showed read. There was no reply. That hurt more than silence. It meant she saw me and chose not to answer. A month passed, then another. I stopped pretending this was accidental. They weren't busy. They were punishing me. What shocked me most wasn't the anger. I understood anger. What shocked me was how easily I was erased. Decades of motherhood, of sacrifice, of showing up wiped away the moment I stopped paying. It forced me to confront a truth I hadn't wanted to see before. The money hadn't been help anymore. It had become the relationship. I tested that theory once, just once. Around the third month, I sent a short message in the family group chat. "Let me know if anyone needs help with school supplies this fall." The replies came fast, too fast. Suddenly, everyone was available. Suddenly, there were questions, updates, concern. One of them even called me directly, voice warm, almost affectionate. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I realized the silence wasn't about hurt feelings. It was leverage. I didn't offer anything. I didn't explain. I simply said I hoped everyone was doing well and ended the call. The silence returned immediately, thicker than before. That was when I stopped reaching out. Without the constant interruptions, I had too much time to think. I started going through old paperwork, organizing things I'd ignored for years, bank statements, insurance documents, receipts. That's when the numbers became impossible to ignore. Seeing everything laid out in black and white was sobering. The total amount I'd given them over the years was more than I'd ever spent on myself. Vacations I never took. Clothes I never bought. Medical care I'd delayed. Also, they could live comfortably without adjusting their own choices. I scheduled an appointment with my financial advisor, the same one my husband trusted. Sitting across from him, I felt embarrassed, like I'd failed some kind of test. He didn't judge me, he didn't scold me, he simply showed me projections. Calmly, clearly. At the rate I'd been going, my safety net would disappear long before I did. I remember gripping the arms of the chair as he spoke, my stomach twisting with a fear I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not fear of loneliness. Fear of being old, broke, and still unwanted. That night I walked through my house differently, not as a mother waiting for company, but as a woman evaluating her life. Every room held a memory, but it also held weight, maintenance, taxes, utilities, space I no longer needed but had been holding onto because I thought it made me relevant. Because I thought it gave me value in their eyes. That's when I noticed something else. The house was no longer home to them. It was an asset, a future payout. They hadn't asked how I was managing alone. They hadn't worried about my health. They were simply waiting. The realization didn't make me cry, it made me calm. A week later, I ran into my daughter-in-law by accident. We were in the same grocery store, 2 aisles apart. I almost called her name, almost reached out. Then I heard her laughing on the phone. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't careful, she didn't know I was there. What she said was casual, almost bored, but it landed like a blow. She talked about waiting things out, about how I'd come around, about how the house would eventually take care of everything. I left my cart in the aisle and walked out. I sat in my car for a long time after that. The anger came later. What I felt first was clarity, clean, sharp, undeniable clarity. They weren't worried about losing me. They were waiting to collect me. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't pace or panic. I made lists. practical ones, places I could live, what I actually needed, what I wanted my days to look like if I stopped living for people who had already written me off. For the first time since my husband died, I wasn't planning around anyone else. The next morning, I made a call, not to my children, not to explain or warn or threaten. I called my advisor and asked one simple question. What would it look like if I sold the house? There was a pause on the line, then he said, "We can talk about that." And that's when I knew this wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. About choosing myself before there was nothing left to choose with. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought I was waiting to break. I wasn't. I was preparing, and they had no idea what was already in motion. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not a friend, not a neighbor, certainly not my family. Silence had become my protection, and for the first time, it worked in my favor. While they assumed I was sulking or waiting for forgiveness, I was doing something far more dangerous to their expectations. I was taking control. The meeting with my financial advisor happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. I remember the weather clearly because it felt symbolic: clear sky, cool air, no storms on the horizon. He laid everything out methodically. The house value, the market demand, the timeline, no drama, no judgment, just facts. And the facts were undeniable. The house they were all counting on was my biggest leverage and my heaviest burden. "What do you want your life to look like after?" he asked me. No one had asked me that in years. I didn't answer right away. I'd spent so long reacting to other people's needs that imagining my own future felt almost selfish. But once I started talking, the words came easily. I wanted quiet. I wanted safety. I wanted to wake up without anxiety, without checking my phone, without wondering who needed something from me that day. I wanted a place where I wasn't a resource to be managed. He nodded and said something that stayed with me. "Then the house is no longer serving you, it's serving everyone else." That settled it. We listed the house discreetly, no announcements, no signs that would catch a neighbor's attention and travel back to my children. Everything was handled quietly, professionally. I walked through each room as preparations were made, watching strangers photograph spaces that had once been sacred. I expected to feel grief. Instead, I felt lighter with every step. The offers came quickly, faster than I expected, strong offers, confident offers. People who wanted the house to live in, not inherit. When I accepted one, I didn't hesitate. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand. No tears. No second guessing. That same week, I started sorting through my life. Not everything, just what mattered. Clothes I hadn't worn in years. Furniture chosen for a family that no longer gathered. Gifts given out of obligation. I donated most of it. I kept only what felt like me. The process was strangely healing. Every box I sealed felt like a boundary reinforced. Then came the phone call I knew would happen eventually. It was my daughter. Her voice was warm, almost cheerful, like nothing had ever happened. She asked how I was doing, told me the kids missed me, mentioned maybe getting together soon. I listened quietly, letting her talk herself into the moment. Then she said it casually, almost as an afterthought. "By the way, is everything okay with the house? Someone said they saw a realtor nearby." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said calmly. "Everything's handled?" The pause on the line was immediate, suspicious, alert. She asked more questions, but I gave her nothing, no details, no reassurance, no explanations. I ended the call politely and sat there, heart steady, knowing the panic had just begun on their end. Over the next few days, the calls increased. Missed calls, voicemails, messages that swung wildly between concern and accusation. I didn't respond, not because I was afraid, but because I had nothing left to say. I'd already said everything that mattered months ago. They just hadn't listened. Packing became more intentional after that. I chose a new place carefully. Somewhere they'd never think to look, somewhere without shared memories, somewhere neutral. I paid in full. No mortgage, no strings. I wanted a clean break in every sense of the word. The day the sale finalized, I didn't celebrate, I didn't mourn. I closed the door to the house one last time, handed over the keys, and walked away without looking back. That chapter of my life had already ended long before the paperwork caught up. I left a note behind, not emotional, not angry, just honest. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my choice. I simply stated the truth, that I had been treated like a resource instead of a person, and I had chosen to step away. I wished them well, nothing more. That night, in a place that was finally mine, my phone lit up again and again. I turned it off. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. They thought cutting me off would force me to fold. They thought silence would weaken me. They never imagined I'd use it to disappear. The first week after I disappeared was unsettling, not because I missed them, but because my body didn't know how to exist without waiting for the next demand. I would wake up in the quiet and feel a jolt of panic as if I'd forgotten something important. A bill, a call, a crisis. Then I'd remember there was nothing left to manage but myself. The new place was small compared to the house I'd sold. No echoing hallways, no rooms filled with ghosts, just clean lines, neutral walls, and a sense of anonymity that felt like safety. No one here knew my name, no one knew my history, and that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't unpack everything right away. I let some boxes sit untouched, like a reminder that I didn't owe anyone immediate access, not even to my past. I moved slowly, deliberately, made coffee in the mornings, sat by the window, watched people walk by without wondering if they needed something from me. The silence from my family lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message came in seconds later, sharp and furious. They knew not just that the house was sold, but that I was gone. No forwarding address, no explanation they could argue with, just absence. The next call came from another number. Then another. They rotated tactics the way they always had: anger, guilt, fear. One message accused me of being cruel. Another warned me I'd made a mistake. One even sounded almost apologetic, as if regret might pull me back into place. It didn't. What surprised me wasn't their outrage. It was how quickly they stopped pretending to care about me and focused entirely on what they'd lost. Not once did anyone ask if I was okay. Not once did anyone ask where I was or whether I was safe. Every message circled the same thing: the house, the money, the future they'd assumed was theirs. That's when it finally hit me: this wasn't a misunderstanding. It never had been. I blocked the numbers one by one, not dramatically, just calmly, like closing doors I no longer needed open. Each block felt final, empowering, quiet. A few days later, a letter arrived at my new address. No return name. Just a familiar handwriting I recognized immediately. I didn't open it at first. I let it sit on the table for hours, reminding myself that I didn't owe anyone access to my peace. When I finally opened it, the words inside confirmed everything. They weren't sorry. They were angry, threatening. They talked about fairness, about family, about how I'd destroyed everything. There was even a vague mention of legal action, as if fear had ever worked on me before. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, as closure. That same week, I met my neighbor for the first time. She'd noticed me moving in and brought over soup, no questions asked. We sat on the balcony talking about nothing important. The weather, the town, the view. It was the easiest conversation I'd had in years. No expectations, no history, just presence. "You seem calm," she said at one point. "I am," I replied, and realized it was true. The days settled into a rhythm: morning walks, afternoons reading, evenings spent learning how to exist without anticipating conflict. It felt unfamiliar, like learning a new language, but it was freeing. Then came the email, not a message, not a call. An email, formal, strategic, sent after they realized emotion wouldn't work. It was from a lawyer, polite, measured, asking me to reconsider, suggesting mediation, hinting that reconciliation would be easier for everyone. I read it once, then again. They still thought this was a negotiation. I forwarded it to my own attorney without comment. Let professionals handle what I no longer carried emotionally. A day later, the response went out: firm, final, unmistakable, no contact, no claims, no further attempts. After that, the noise stopped. Weeks passed, then months. And something unexpected happened. I started laughing again, not the polite kind, the real kind. I started making plans without checking anyone else's schedule. I bought things because I liked them, not because they were practical or impressive. I stopped apologizing for existing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I realized something that made me sit still for a long time. They hadn't just lost the house. They'd lost access to me. And that was the part they never saw coming. Because while they were busy counting what they thought they'd inherit, I had already chosen something far more valuable: freedom, and I wasn't done choosing yet. By the time the third month passed, I understood something I hadn't expected. Freedom isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, almost cautiously, like it's waiting to see if you'll chase it away. I didn't. Instead, I began noticing how much of my life had been built around anticipation. Anticipating requests, emergencies, guilt. Even now, in this calm, my body would tense when the phone buzzed, only to soften when I saw it was just a weather alert or a reminder from the pharmacy. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer, I found an old notebook. Inside were lists, meticulous, handwritten, school supplies I'd bought, bills I'd paid for others, dates, amounts, little notes beside each entry. Temporary help, just this once, they'll pay me back. I sat on the floor reading page after page, and something inside me shifted. I hadn't just helped them, I had financed their lives. And worse, I had taught them that my role was to fix everything. I closed the notebook and didn't put it back. I threw it away. I didn't need records anymore. I didn't need proof. I finally believed myself. That same week, I ran into someone who knew me from my old life, a distant acquaintance. She recognized me at a cafe, eyes widening in surprise. "I heard you moved," she said carefully. "Your family's been asking around." I smiled, polite and calm. "I moved, yes." "They seemed worried," she added, uncertain. Worried. That word used to soften me, used to pull me back into explanations and reassurance. But now it landed differently. "I'm fine," I said simply. "Better than I've been in years." She nodded, still processing, then changed the subject. We talked about nothing important. When she left, I realized something else. I hadn't felt the need to defend myself, not once. The guilt they'd trained into me was losing its grip. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't angry, it was strategic. Carefully worded, it talked about forgiveness, about how time had cooled emotions, about how maybe we could start fresh. I recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't reconciliation, this was recalibration. They had adjusted their approach now that intimidation and threats hadn't worked. I didn't respond. Silence, I learned, is only cruel to people who are used to controlling the narrative. In the evenings, I started taking walks through the neighborhood. No destination, no urgency, just movement. On one of those walks, I passed a small park where an older woman was teaching her granddaughter how to ride a bike. The child wobbled, fell, got back up. The woman never rushed her, never scolded, just encouraged. I watched from a distance longer than I meant to. That used to be me, I thought, always steady, always present. Somewhere along the way, I'd confused love with endurance. The next morning, I called my financial advisor, not to ask for help, but to say thank you, to close accounts, to simplify, to make sure everything I had was aligned with the life I was building now, not the one I'd escaped. He paused at one point and said, "You sound lighter." "I am," I replied. I finally stopped carrying things that weren't mine. A week later, a mutual relative reached out, not to ask how I was, but to relay a message. "They're struggling," she said, "really struggling. They didn't think you'd actually go through with it." I felt a flicker of something, sadness maybe, but it didn't bloom into guilt. "They thought I'd bend," I said quietly. "I spent years proving them right." There was a long silence on the line. "Well," she said finally, "I guess they're learning." That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no anxiety, just rest. And for the first time since I'd disappeared, I allowed myself to think about the future, not in terms of survival, but in terms of possibility. I didn't know exactly what that future would look like, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going back, and whatever came next would be built on my terms alone. The 6th month marked a quiet turning point, one that didn't arrive with drama or confrontation, but with something far more unsettling: acceptance. Not theirs, mine. I stopped wondering what they were saying about me. Stopped imagining conversations I wasn't part of. Stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. The space they left behind was no longer an ache, it had become room. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone overnight, not once. No dread, no half-sleep jolts, just rest. That was when I knew something fundamental had changed. I had untangled myself. That afternoon, I received another message through a third party. This one wasn't angry or manipulative. It was practical. They wanted to talk logistics. I laughed out loud when I read that, logistics. As if love had ever been logistical when I was paying their bills. As if birthdays, emergencies, tuition, rent, and repairs had been neat transactions instead of emotional leverage wrapped in obligation. I didn't respond. Instead, I went out. I drove to a nearby town I'd never visited, wandered into a small bookstore, and bought a novel simply because the first line intrigued me. No one knew me there. No one expected anything from me. I sat in a cafe for 2 hours reading, unnoticed and unneeded, and it felt like a luxury I hadn't known I was allowed to have. That night, I made a decision that had been forming quietly for weeks. I rewrote my will, not in anger, not in retaliation, but with clarity. I removed assumptions. I removed expectations that no longer made sense. I redirected what remained of my estate toward places that aligned with who I was now, organizations that helped women rebuild after financial abuse, after emotional abandonment, after being erased by the very people they loved. When I signed the final document, my hand didn't shake. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was choosing myself. A few days later, I ran into an old neighbor while buying groceries. She looked surprised to see me, then relieved. "They said you'd vanished," she said cautiously. "I moved," I replied. "That's all." She hesitated. "They've been telling people you're not well." I nodded slowly. I'd expected that. It was easier to discredit me than to confront what they'd done. "I'm very well," I said calmly. "Better than I've ever been." She studied my face for a moment, then smiled softly. "You look it." That was the moment it stopped mattering what version of me they were selling, because I knew the truth. The next attempt came a week later, this time direct. A message slipped through from a number I hadn't blocked yet. Short, measured, almost respectful. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I read it once, then deleted it. Too far. As if cutting me off hadn't been far. As if treating me like a utility account hadn't crossed any lines. As if silence had only become unacceptable once it stopped benefiting them. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sky darken. The mountains in the distance held their shape even as the light changed, unmoved, steady. I realized something then. They were uncomfortable because I had removed myself from the role they'd assigned me. And people who benefit from your silence never forgive you for finding your voice, even if you use it only to say nothing at all. I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted to something small but powerful. The end of explanation. The following days were peaceful, almost suspiciously so. No messages, no intermediaries, just quiet. Then came the knock. It startled me not because I was afraid, but because I hadn't expected anyone at all. I didn't open the door immediately. I checked the camera first. It was one of them, standing there without anger, without entitlement. Just uncertain. I waited. Another knock. Softer this time. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid of what would happen if I did, but because I was finally certain of what would happen if I didn't. They left after a few minutes. And I felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, just confirmation. Later that night, I slept deeply again. And as I drifted off, one thought surfaced, clear and unshakable. They were beginning to understand that I wasn't coming back. But they still had no idea what that would cost them. And that realization, when it fully landed, was still waiting just ahead. By the 7th month, the silence around me had changed its tone. It was no longer empty. It was observant. The messages had stopped. The indirect inquiries faded. Even the rumors meant to pull me back into reaction had quieted. What remained was something far more uncomfortable for them than anger or grief. Irreversibility. I sensed it in small ways. A forwarded message from a distant cousin asking if I was really done. A vague update from an old acquaintance who mentioned that things weren't going well on their end. Nothing direct. Nothing honest, just the slow awareness spreading outward that I was no longer reachable, no longer adjustable. That realization unsettles people who once had access to you. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I came across an envelope that hadn't gone through the usual channels. No lawyer, no mediator, just a handwritten address. Inside was a letter, not an apology, not quite. It spoke about stress, about pressure, about misunderstandings. It mentioned responsibility without taking any, love without acknowledgement, regret without accountability. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't throw it away. I didn't respond either. I kept it as proof, not for them, but for myself. Proof of how far I'd come. That evening I had dinner with friends I'd met since moving, people who knew me only as I am now. Not as a mother who gives, but as a woman who listens, laughs, and chooses. One of them asked casually, "Do you ever miss your old life?" I thought about it carefully. "I miss who I was before I learned I was being used," I said. "But I don't miss the role I was trapped in." She nodded, understanding more than I expected. Later that night, I took out the photo album I'd brought with me, the single one I'd allowed myself to keep. I flipped through it slowly without the ache that once accompanied those memories. The faces hadn't changed, I had, and that mattered. A few days later, something happened that confirmed everything. I received notice, indirect again, that the house I sold had become a point of fixation. Not grief, not nostalgia, resentment. They were still talking about it, still measuring what might have been. Still circling a door that had closed long ago. That was when it finally clicked. They hadn't lost me when I stopped paying their bills. They lost me when they assumed I wouldn't leave. That assumption had been their anchor, their safety net, their blind spot. And now, without it, they were adrift. I didn't feel satisfaction in that, but I felt resolved. The next morning, I finalized one more thing I'd been postponing, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be deliberate. I changed my contact information, not out of fear, out of completion. I left forwarding instructions for essential institutions, for friends, for professionals who respected boundaries, not for them. That afternoon, I walked through my neighborhood slowly, intentionally. I knew the faces now, the rhythms, the quiet corners. This was my life, not a waiting room, not a fallback, a destination. That night, I sat alone with a cup of tea, watching the lights across the valley flicker on one by one. I thought about the version of me that would have agonized over this moment, wondering if I was being cruel, if I was doing permanent damage, if I'd regret it when it was too late. That woman believed love meant sacrifice without limit. This woman knows better. Love that costs you your dignity is not love, it is extraction. And once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. I went to bed knowing something was approaching, not confrontation, not reconciliation, but realization, on their side. The kind that arrives late. And when it did, it would land hard, because there would be no one left to negotiate with. Only the truth they'd avoided, and the quiet space where I used to be. By the 8th month, the story had already ended. They just didn't know it yet. I understood that one morning while standing on my balcony watching fog roll gently across the mountains. It moved slowly, deliberately, uncovering and hiding the landscape at its own pace. Nothing rushed it. Nothing chased it away. That was when I realized I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. I already had it. The final attempt came quietly, almost respectfully. A message sent through someone who meant well but didn't fully understand. They're asking if you'd at least meet, just once. No money, no pressure. Just a conversation? I read the words carefully. Months ago, that message would have undone me. I would have replayed every memory, every birthday, every sacrifice. I would have wondered if this was my last chance to fix something broken. But now I felt something else. Clarity. I typed a short reply. "I wish them well, I'm not available." That was it. No explanation, no defense, no reopening of wounds. I pressed send and felt nothing afterward. No rush, no fear, no guilt. Just stillness. That afternoon, I went for a walk and noticed things I might have missed before. The sound of wind in the trees, the rhythm of my steps, the way my shoulders no longer carried tension without reason. My body had learned what my mind already knew. I was safe. Not because someone was protecting me, but because I had finally protected myself. A few weeks later, I heard, indirectly, faintly, that reality had set in on their side. That the money was gone. That the safety net they'd relied on had never been guaranteed. That the house they counted on now belonged to strangers who were repainting the walls, planting new flowers, making new memories. I imagined them standing outside that truth, unsure where to place their anger now that there was nowhere for it to land. And for the first time, I felt compassion without responsibility. Their lives were no longer mine to manage. I spent my days intentionally, slowly. I volunteered more. I traveled when I wanted. I learned how to enjoy mornings without anxiety and evenings without dread. Sometimes I thought about the version of me who believed love meant enduring anything. I wished I could tell her this. You don't have to disappear to be free. You just have to stop paying the price for other people's choices. The last physical reminder of my old life arrived one day in the form of a forwarded envelope. Something that had been mailed to my old address months too late. Inside was nothing important, just paperwork that no longer applied to me. I shredded it without hesitation. That small act felt symbolic, final. That night, as I sat with a book open on my lap, phone silent, life steady, I reflected on what they'd truly lost. Not the house, not the money. They lost access to someone who would have given everything until there was nothing left. And what I gained wasn't revenge, it was peace. It was dignity. It was a life no longer built around fear of abandonment. If they ever look back, and I know they will, they won't remember the moment I sold the house. They'll remember the moment I stopped responding. The moment they realized I was no longer available to be used. And by then, it will be far too late, because I didn't just disappear. I finally arrived in a life that belongs to me.